So Vladimir Putin just admitted to something that many of us never thought he would actually admit. And I guess in a way he didn't admit it, at least not directly, not with clear, clean words and statements. But he did admit it through his actions and the implications of the words that he did use. Just today, we got the headlines announcing that Vladimir Putin had shared that starting in 2026, the Russian military budget would begin to decrease because the military budget has become such a burden on Russian society, something that Putin has denied in the past, but that he's now being forced to admit to with his actions. Essentially, what is going on in Russia is that inflation is getting extremely high, and it's creating a whole suite of economic problems that I've described in depth in other videos. And I've been saying for a long time that the Russian people are going to get tired of this, and they are going to ask for changes. And it seems that Vladimir Putin is finally admitting to this, trying to throw his people a bone by promising that military payments, that military funding is going to decrease, and that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Analyzing this statement is extremely important. When you analyze this statement, it's almost impossible to take it at face value, because as we've seen from politicians, especially politicians at war, we see that they are regularly willing to change their minds, and they can think of any excuse to do it. And so, if we're taking this statement at face value that Russia's military budget will decrease next year, we probably shouldn't do that. Because indeed, Putin could just come up with a reason and an excuse a year from now to increase military spending if he wanted to. And he's shown himself more than capable of doing that from a propaganda standpoint. The question we have to ask then is, why is Vladimir Putin going to his people now and making this kind of statement in the first place? And to fully understand the answer to that, we first need to lay a little bit of groundwork. Throughout the war, I have seen a misconception, in my mind, a misconception, where people say that Vladimir Putin does not care what the Russian people think. Because it's very clear from his actions that Vladimir Putin doesn't care about the Russian people. He's very clearly willing to use them, and I agree to this, for his own purposes, whether that means from an economic standpoint or from a military standpoint. He doesn't care if the Russian people suffer financially or physically. But a lot of people convolute this into thinking that he doesn't care what the Russian people think, which is actually not true at all. A more accurate understanding is that Vladimir Putin doesn't care what happens to the Russian people as long as, while it's happening, they think he's still a pretty good guy and he's the leader that their country needs. If Vladimir Putin did not care what the Russian people think, he would not invest so much effort in state-sponsored propaganda. We would not have Russian state television going on night after night after night after night, trying to create a propagandistic excuse for every single thing that Russia does, and trying to cover up every single Russian loss on the battlefield, and trying to spin it as a positive, as if Russia is actually winning against the combined forces of the entire West. That's not the kind of thing you do when you don't care what your people think. It's clear then that Vladimir Putin cares what his people think from the perspective of he does not ever want there to be internal opposition within Russia that is able to rise up against him with force or with scale. This is also, for example, the reason that Vladimir Putin frequently arrests and sometimes even has killed in prison Russian opposition leaders, because he does not want opposition movements to take off inside of Russia. He wants to control the narrative, control the actions of the people. He knows that this doesn't work on everybody, but he knows it will work on a sufficient majority in order to keep him in power. So now that we understand all of this, we can look a little more closely at the significance of this new statement from Vladimir Putin, where he is having to admit to things that it is very clear he would rather not admit to. Now, the work behind today's episode was made possible by private internet access. As you can probably guess, due to the nature of my YouTube channel, I take my internet security seriously, as I'm constantly being targeted by people who want to gain access to my accounts and my private information and use it for nefarious purposes. To help protect myself, I take a multi-layered approach to my digital privacy, and one of the most essential pieces of that is a VPN. Specifically, I've enjoyed using private internet access. Private internet access encrypts your internet connection and helps to mask your location. Because normally, whenever you're on the internet on an unprotected device, you transmit a lot of information that can potentially be viewed by various different entities. And with private internet access, you can even connect to the internet and make it look like you're logging in from a different country. Not only does that keep you private, but it also allows you to access content that you might not otherwise be able to see. That could be anything from the news to a different Netflix catalog specific to a different country. The best part is, you can use private internet access on all of your different platforms, whether that be Windows, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, or even a whole lot more. And you can cover an unlimited amount of devices with just one subscription. For someone like me, these features are essential, and honestly, it's something I think everyone should probably be thinking about. So if you want to get started with private internet access, you can actually get a really great deal of 83% off plus an extra 4 months for free when you purchase an annual plan. And you can get that deal by using my link. So if you want to get started, just click my link in the description of this video or scan the QR code on screen. With that said, let's get back to the video. Now, this should go without needing explanation, but typically when a country is at war, and their war has been portrayed to their people as a righteous cause, that country is not going to back down on providing whatever support for their military is needed to accomplish the actual objectives. When we look at any of the countries involved in World War II, for example, we see full wartime economies that were largely supported by their people, with everybody in the country getting behind the military, getting behind production for the military in order to achieve their goals. Because all of these countries truly believed, or had been led to believe by their leaders, that the war truly was existential. And so the people were willing to bear quite a significant burden in order to see victory through. And I've explained for a long time that I don't think that this is the case among the Russian people at all. I think many Russian people are deceived by the government, but I also think a lot of Russians can kind of see through what's going on, given their own history. And even if they don't oppose the war, a lot of Russians aren't super supportive of the war. And now what we're seeing from Vladimir Putin is really an admission of this for the very first time. Because he is admitting to himself that he has to make a concession to the Russian people that this war will end soon, or at least the impact of the war will be reduced soon, in order to keep the people supporting him. We see Vladimir Putin doing some calculus in his head, asking himself, should I go to the Russian people with a propaganda campaign trying to convince them to double down into a full wartime economy beyond what we've already seen, full wartime economy with things like rationing and making people work overtime? Do I think that the Russian people will agree to this, or do I actually have to make concessions to the Russian people, because if I push them any further, I'm pushing them too far? And we see Vladimir Putin very clearly making the choice to at least verbally make a concession to the people because he's afraid of pushing them too far. In Russian history, this is, of course, not the first time that we have seen something like this. In the Tsarist Russia, although it's a more dramatic example, we saw that prior to the full-on Russian Revolution, there was kind of a sputtering revolution in the early 1900s that fizzled out and failed, but that as part of this revolution, the Tsar was forced to give concessions to the Russian people, to give them a constitution and a parliament, although he gave those concessions to them half-heartedly and didn't really get behind and support those things. The reason he gave the concessions in the first place was because he knew that if he didn't give any concessions to the Russian people, that there could be even more massive rebellion and that his regime could crack and crumble. So he made concessions with his words that his heart wasn't really behind in order to appease them, hoping to buy himself more time to achieve his actual agenda. And that is sort of what I personally think Vladimir Putin is probably doing right now. I don't think Vladimir Putin actually intends to lower the Russian military budget next year. I think all his actions have shown that he is very committed to the war in Ukraine and is going to continue on that despite the cost. But I do think Vladimir Putin recognizes that at this moment in time, he needs to portray to the Russian people that there is a light at the end of the tunnel to get their continued support for the next moment, which will buy him time to create a more sufficient propaganda campaign to get the Russian people more behind supporting the war in a fuller sense. And at that time, Putin can say, look, I went to you and I told you that I wanted to lower the military budget, but look at all these things that have happened. Unfortunately, as you can all see, we just can't do that anymore. And even in that, he can portray himself as kind of the good guy, as the guy who kind of tried to disengage, even though he was the one who engaged with the problem in the first place and caused the problem in the first place. However, whatever the case, whether it is a genuine attempt to lower the military budget or just an attempt to appease the people and deceive them until the next year, it's undoubtable that Putin is only making this decision to appease the people, which means that Putin is beginning to fear his people a little bit more and is realizing that that pressure has to change his behavior, at least to an extent. What that means is that all of the cracks that we have been talking about appearing in Russia are very real. And I think it's actually very interesting the timing of Putin giving these concessions coming out of this economic conference in St. Petersburg, where at the conference, Putin was trying to put on a strong face for Russia, trying to say their GDP was growing, saying the country was stable financially, but essentially now being forced to make changes financially because it is obvious to the Russian people that they are being economically destroyed, that inflation in particular is destroying them, and it is obvious to the Russian people that those economic problems are a direct consequence of the war against Ukraine. Putin obviously can't disengage from the war in Ukraine, so he's not promising to lower the military budget immediately, but he's saying, hey, maybe next year we can do that. The thing is that when we see leaders having to appease their people internally to keep support for the war ongoing, you realize that the war effort is already coming to an end. Not right away, but you realize that internally the support for that is disappearing, which means you will soon begin to see people more frustrated with it. You will potentially see more people standing up to the government. You will see less people willing to fight the country's wars and all of these things. And these are the cracks that could ultimately lead Russia to finally lose the conflict. It is not a short game. It's a long game with milestones along the way. That in mind, we should all see this as what it really is. A moment of weakness and a rare moment of admission of weakness from a government that persistently puts out extremely positive propaganda. That should impact the way everybody views the war in Ukraine, and whether or not Ukraine can outlast Russia in a war of attrition. Here we are seeing within Russia very real cracks. And so the question now is a matter of endurance. Can Ukraine continue to hold on until those cracks have their ultimate effect? Or will people back away from Ukraine prematurely before they have a chance to win the war that they can and will in fact win if they have sufficient support? Now, this video is a little shorter, responding to what just happened today, because I have a full-length video already that I recently published explaining in depth the economic problems that Putin is now responding to. So be sure to check out that video if you want to know in detail how the Russian economy is crumbling and all the different problems that it's facing. I also have another video explaining why Russia is not winning the war and the strategy that is being pursued by Ukraine effectively to beat them. So be sure to check out that video too. because both of those videos are incredibly relevant in the face of this crack that has just shown up. That said, before I close, I just want to say a quick thank you to all of the patrons, all of the people who buy me coffees, and all of the people who do YouTube Super Thanks and all the other ways you support my work on this channel. I am supported financially to a large degree by members of this community and viewers like yourself. So thank you again for everyone who has chipped in, and I look forward to making more videos for you very soon. See you on the next one.